This is a video about interpersonal relationships, how and why people can be a nightmare and what you can do about it. David Bird here, therapist, coach, counsellor, change worker, whatever. Today I'm going to talk to you about a model of communication called the Interpersonal Behaviour Circumplex, which is quite a mouthful. It's also called the Rose of Leary, or Leary's Rose. So it's called Leary's Rose because it was developed by a guy called Timothy Leary. Now you might know Timothy Leary from the 1960s counterculture hippie movement, basically. He was a psychologist and activist at, I forget which university it was in America. And he coined the phrase turn on, tune in and drop out, and set and setting. And set and setting was basically about how when you're taking psychedelic drugs, it's important to make sure that your environment's good and you're in the right mindset. Otherwise, you're going to have a bad trip. But before he got into all of that, he studied psychotherapy groups, and he came up with this model of communication afterwards. So this model has two axes. There's a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. Now, for a long time when I've been working with clients, I've often talked about the axis of connection and about status. Now, I think a lot of people are very aware of connection, but we don't often think about status, or at least not in my experience. I thought I'd come up with something quite novel, and then when I was studying my psychology degree, I came across this, and I was like, oh, somebody's done this before. But also, it then filled in a lot of blanks for me. So the first axis is the vertical axis. So this, like I said, this is really about status. The other words that are associated with it are power, control, dominance, assertiveness, and ambitiousness. Some people phrase this as the agency axis, which makes sense to me because if you've got someone who's high status, generally they will feel higher in capability. Whether they are capable or not is another matter, but they will feel like they have more capability, whereas someone who is lower status, they will often feel less capable. And the thing about the vertical axis is that opposites attract. So dominance creates submission, and submission creates dominance as a general rule. So essentially, if you somebody who comes in higher status, they're more likely to get people to submit, and vice versa. On the other axis, on the horizontal axis, this is phrased as communion. I prefer connection, but words that are associated with it are agreeableness, compassion, nurturance, solidarity, friendliness, warmth, affiliation, and love. And the interesting thing about this axis is that like attracts like. So it's not like the status axis where when you take one position, you're more likely to create the opposite. If you come in with more love, you get more love, and if you come in with more hate or more disconnection, you'll get more disconnection. So this reminds me of the phrase "kill them with kindness," or if you're quite short or cold with somebody, they'll do the same. I worked with a trainer once called Trevor who he always talked about his "fuck off" shield. And I'm sure you've had the experience of someone walking in a room and they've got their eyes down and they're trying to avoid you, and it doesn't really make them very approachable. So this is what the model looks like with all four extremes, and it's worth noting that all of these can interact. That both of these can interact at the same time, and so somebody can be high dominance and high warmth, but they could also be high dominance and high hate or hostility, if you like. Now, there's a couple of researchers in 2020 called Allison and Allison, and they basically used Leary's model to create a model for investigative interviewing and for building rapport. Now, they did the research by basically reviewing and analysing a bunch of crime interviews, victims of violent crime, I believe. And their big finding was essentially that you could have an adaptive and a maladaptive version of each one of the patterns that we talked about. Now, they used animals as a kind of like a personality, as a stereotype, if you like, to make it more memorable, which I think is quite useful. And essentially what they found was that adaptive patterns create adaptive patterns in other people, and adaptive response and maladaptive responses create maladaptive responses. So it's more of that, you get what you give. So, for example, the first one is the good lion. So the good lion, it takes charge, advises, conversational, non-judgmental, all those kind of things. I like to think of the good lion as the noble king, kind of like Mufasa, king of the animal kingdom, someone you look up to, gives that sense of authority, but you trust them. It's like dominant but trusting. So that's why I think of it as the noble king. And then you get the good mouse. The good mouse is someone who's patient, persistent, modest, those kind of things. They'll seek advice. I like to think of this as the good servant or the good student. There's someone who's diligent and they're open to learning at the same time. But then we get the maladaptive patterns on the vertical axis. So the first then is the bad lion. So for me, the bad lion is like the tyrannical king or the helicopter parent, or you might even say the micromanager. They're domineering and controlling. So they've got the sense of status, some might say arrogance, but it's not trusting. It's not leading, it's more controlling. And then at the bottom of that axis, we've then got the bad mouse. So the bad mouse is irritable, resentful, disengaged and avoiding conflict. Now I think about the petulant child here, or maybe not the petulant child, it's more actually the passive aggressive employee. So I don't know whether you've ever met that person who, they're there just for the wages, and actually they secretly kind of hate everybody, but they're quite two-faced about it, and they'll do passive aggressive things, like they'll turn up late, or they won't do things properly, or they'll do just enough. Whereas if you confront them about it, they'll often be they might be very nice, or they might feign ignorance. It might be only when you really get to know them that you realise that they're kind of bitter and got a chip on their shoulder, but they're not very conflictual, if that's the word. They won't conflict. They won't enter into conflict. That's what I meant. So on the other side of the horizontal axis, we get the good T-Rex. So the good T-Rex is someone who's confident, assertive, but critical and forthright. Basically, there's somebody who doesn't mince their words. So I like to think of the wise warrior in this sense. If you've seen The Karate Kid, I think of Mr. Miyagi. Now, Mr. Miyagi, he can come across as a very quiet man to begin with, and he's just, he's a man of few words, all that sort of thing. But then there's that scene where all of the kids try and beat him up, all the teenagers, they try and beat him up, and he wipes the floor with them. Now, for me, that kind of archetype, stereotype, if you like, it's because it's somebody who's done enough of the work that they know how to use force, but they choose not to, and they use appropriate force. So the good T-Rex is somebody who's confident enough in themselves and their position that they can challenge people, but they won't be a dick about it. So then we have the good monkey on the other side. So the good monkey is someone who's respectful, trusting. They're a team player, basically. So I think of this as the team connector, really. This is the person that knows everyone and checks in at the company. They're the go-to guy. They may not know how to do everything, but they'll know what's going on, and they'll know who you need to talk to. You come to them with a problem, and they'll be like, you need to talk to Sharon in accounts, or you need to talk to Steve in manufacturing, or whatever it is. But then we get the maladaptive patterns on the horizontal axis. So then we've got the bad T-Rex. So he's judgmental, unfriendly, argumentative, and he'll attack people. Essentially, this is the combative mismatcher. So this is the person that just argues black is white for the hell of it. They're just always out to pick a fight. They've got a chip on their shoulder. So it might seem a bit. It's like. It almost is another version of the passive aggressive person, but they're not very passive about it. Okay, and then we get the bad monkey. So the bad monkey is basically they're an insecure pick me person. Really, that's how I like to think about it. They're a try hard. They basically give you the icky feel because they might be very attentive, but they're over familiar. They're over connected, and it comes from a sense of basically a fear of rejection, a fear of not being liked. So this is looking at them all together. Now this might look quite complicated, but I really focus on when I'm thinking about this. It's like where is a person spatially? Like, is it a distant response, which in Leary's model is more like it's more one side and one and one the other. I think of it more like this is connection, this is lots of love, and this is lots of hate, if you like. Whereas then the distance here, this is about status and submission. For me, that's the place to start, is like, how connected do you feel to this person? What's the distance like? But then also, what's the status? So how can you use this model? Well, something I found that people often do, and I'm definitely guilty of, is when interpersonal interaction is not going very well, it's really easy to blame the other person and be like, well, they need to be showing up differently. They shouldn't have done this. But that can be quite a disempowering position. And I found this when I started doing frontline work for the NHS. So I found at certain times and certain situations, I would have some very difficult interactions with patients, and a few of them got me into trouble. But what was interesting was when I was taking calls, just listening to my colleagues, sometimes I could hear them creating the problem or making the problem worse because of the way that they were responding. And just through shifting some of my responses, the timing that I did, and now looking at this, it was the way I showed up within my position, whether I brought more connection or I took more of a dominant role. It started to transform the interactions. So something I found was if somebody would come to me and they'd be very anxious and scatty and upset, I could initially get very irritated by them. But then that's actually just going to cause them to get more irritated or more stressed, because that's quite a low status position I'm taking. And then in a way I'm putting them up, and then if they're going up here and I'm almost below them, then that's just going to cause them to be more anxious because then they're higher status. But I found if I could take a more leading and assertive role, then I could calm things down. And I don't mean that in a patronising way or in a forceful way. It was just, being able to, in a way, give them the comfort and assurance that I could help. But at the same time, if people would then come to me quite aggressively, my initial reaction was to give them the same back. Now, sometimes it would work to a point that they would realise, I suppose, from a status perspective, they would realise that I wasn't going to back down. That they couldn't just talk to me like that. But it didn't necessarily make the interaction any better. So if they were coming at me, more T-Rex, and I went T-Rex at them, it just got us more T-Rex. And I remember when I was younger, always hearing the phrase "kill 'em with kindness," and I never got it. But I've really found that to be true now. Now, it's something that I've found it's taken me a long time to get used to and to practice, because my initial reaction, if somebody comes at me, is to want to attack them back. And I do think there's an important distinction in kind of if somebody comes and they're being attacking, it's important to take the lead, at least in a position like that where I'm trying to help them to stay higher status, to stay in the lead, but to come from that noble king, that loving side, than rather attacking. And I don't know, 9 times out of 10 I've found if I'm able to take a deep breath and not attack them back, if I bring the love, as it were, if I stay connected, that they'll actually calm down and then they'll mirror me. And that fits Leary's model perfectly. And I think it's good to use as a perspective or as a rule of thumb rather than absolute truth, because there are some terribly difficult people out there and they are the problem. But if that's always the case, or that's the first position, then again it's quite powerless. And I found even with the really difficult people, if I ask the question, well, how is this about me, how I'm showing up, or at least what could I do differently, then when I do that, because I've changed my response, I've changed the connection between us, I've changed the whole relationship, and therefore in a way they will start to change too. So if you found this video useful or interesting in any way, please like, comment, share, do all that fun stuff that we ask people to do on social media these days. Or if you have any questions, or if you've got any requests for future content, I'd love to hear.